The phone rang 4 times before Sujin picked it up, and she would spend the rest of her life wishing she'd let it ring a fifth. Mrs. Chukwu? The voice on the other end was careful in a way that made her stomach drop before he said another word. This is Officer Reyes. I need you to sit down. She didn't sit down. She stood in the kitchen with one shoe on. She'd been halfway out the door to pick up Jide from his father's, and listened to a stranger explain that there had been an accident on the overpass, that the other driver had run the light, that Obi hadn't made it to the hospital. The shoe stayed by the door for 3 days. Nobody moved it. Nobody could. 6 years later, a different phone buzzed on a nightstand in an empty room, and nobody was there to answer it. Jeed was already halfway out the window. He moved like he'd done it before, because he had, one leg over the sill, sneaker toes finding the ledge he'd measured with his eyes a dozen times from his bed at night. Below him, the backyard was dark and quiet, the motion sensor light disabled 2 weeks ago with a strip of black tape he'd stolen from his mother's junk drawer. 8 years old, and he already knew that the world rewarded patience. The tracker app on the phone he'd left behind blinked green. At home. Safe. A lie. Glowing on a screen in an empty room. If you're the kind of person who needs to know what happens next before you can breathe right, you're in the right place. Stick around, because this story only gets heavier from here, and you won't want to miss where it lands. Hit subscribe now so you don't lose it. Jide dropped the last 3 feet and landed soft, the way Blessing had taught him. Knees bent, weight forward, don't lock your legs. He didn't run. Running looked guilty. He walked, fast and low along the hedge line, cutting through the Osei's yard and out onto the street where the porch lights hadn't yet noticed him. 2 blocks. That was all it took to get from a house with locks on the inside of the windows to a house where the front door was propped open with a broken fan because nobody had gotten around to fixing the latch. Blessing was waiting on the low wall outside, swinging her legs, eating something out of a bag that crinkled every time she moved. "You're late," she said, not looking up. "My mom checked on me twice tonight instead of once. She's getting smarter. She's getting scared." Blessing held out the bag. Chips, the cheap kind, the kind Sujin would never have allowed in the house because of the sodium content on a label she read like scripture. Jide took a handful anyway. It tasted like freedom, which is to say it tasted like nothing special at all, which was the whole point. They didn't talk about much. That was the thing nobody understood about the two of them. The adults, when they eventually found out, would ask, "What do you even do over there?" As if friendship required a purpose. Mostly they sat. Mostly Blessing complained about her spelling homework and Jide listened, because at his house nobody complained about anything. Everything simply was scheduled, and complaining implied a kind of freedom he didn't have, the freedom to think something could be different. "You should come inside," Blessing said eventually. "My dad's not back till 11. We could watch something." Jide checked the position of the moon out of habit, the closest thing he had to a watch he was allowed to ignore. "I have 11 minutes. You always have 11 minutes. That's how long it takes her to fall asleep on the couch and wake up and check the app again." Blessing didn't ask why he counted his mother's habits down to the minute the way other kids counted sheep. She'd stopped asking things like that months ago. Around the same time, she stopped explaining why she made her own dinner most nights. Some things you just understood about a friend without needing them spelled out. That was maybe the realest thing they had. He was 3 minutes late getting back. Sujin was standing in the kitchen when he climbed back through the window, and the look on her face wasn't anger. It was worse than anger. It was the look of someone doing math she never wanted to do again. If he can be gone 11 minutes without me knowing, how long could he be gone before I never know at all? Where were you? Not a question. A demand dressed as one. I couldn't sleep. I went outside for air. Through the window, Jide. He said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse, and because some quiet, stubborn part of him, the part that had learned to want things without asking, because asking never worked, thought it was worth it. Sujin crossed the kitchen and picked up his phone off the counter, the one that had lied to her for 11 minutes, glowing green the whole time. She looked at it like it had betrayed her personally. "I trusted this," she said, quiet now, which was somehow more frightening than the shouting would have been. I trusted you. Nothing happened. You don't know that. You're 8. You don't know what happens to me either. You're never there. The words came out sharper than he meant, sharper than an 8-year-old should be able to aim a sentence, and he watched them land on her like a slap she hadn't seen coming. She didn't yell back. She just stood there for a long moment, phone in hand, and then she said, very softly, I am always there. That's the whole problem, isn't it? You just don't want me to be. That night, she changed the code on the window locks. She didn't sleep. She sat in the hallway outside his door with a book she didn't read a single page of, listening to him breathe, telling herself this was love, telling herself 100 times until the sun came up that this was love, and not something else wearing its clothes. If you've ever had someone love you so hard it felt like a cage, you already know exactly where this story is going. And if you've ever been the one doing the caging because you were too scared to stop, this one's going to sting a little. Either way, drop a comment and tell me which side you're on, because trust me, by the end you might not be so sure anymore. Across town, in a house with a door that didn't lock right, Emeka Adeyemi got home at 11:40, exhausted in the particular way that comes from carrying 2 jobs and a household on the same set of shoulders. Blessing was asleep on the couch with the TV still on, homework half finished on the coffee table, a bowl of cereal gone soft beside her. Dinner, apparently, self-served, self-cleared, self-everything, the way it had been for 2 years now. He turned off the TV. He looked at the math worksheet, unfinished, the last 3 problems blank where she'd clearly given up or fallen asleep trying. He didn't wake her to finish it. He carried her to bed instead, the way you carry something you're afraid of dropping, and stood in her doorway a moment longer than he needed to, doing his own private math. How many nights like this before she stops needing me to carry her at all? He didn't know yet that 2 blocks away, another parent had spent that same hour standing guard over a door, terrified of a different kind of loss. He didn't know that in a few weeks, their 2 very different failures were going to collide. Hard, in a kitchen, neither of them wanted to be standing in. The next morning, Soo-jin was waiting outside the school gate at pickup. Early, the way she always was, 15 minutes before the bell so she could watch the door and count heads as they came out. A habit she'd never quite been able to name out loud, though anyone paying attention would have called it what it was. She spotted Jide walking out beside a girl with 2 uneven braids and a backpack covered in stickers, laughing at something. Actually laughing in a way she hadn't seen at home in longer than she wanted to admit. The girl's father was there too, jogging up late, tie loosened, phone still in his hand from a call he was clearly still half finishing. He caught his daughter's hand, apologized for being late, and it was in that exact motion, the half turn, the tired half smile, something about the way he tucked his phone away like it was something he was embarrassed to still be holding, that Soo-jin felt a small, strange itch at the back of her skull, like a word on the tip of her tongue, like she'd seen this exact gesture somewhere before, a lifetime ago in a room she couldn't quite place. She didn't chase the feeling. She didn't have time to. She was too busy watching her son laugh with a stranger's daughter and feeling, for reasons she couldn't have explained if you'd asked her, more afraid than she'd felt in years. "Who's that?" she asked when Jide reached her. Too casually, the way parents ask questions they've already decided they won't like the answer to. "Blessing," Jide said. "She's my friend. I haven't met her mother. She doesn't have one. Not really. Not here." Something in the way he said it, flat, factual, no cruelty in it, just a child repeating a fact he'd absorbed without understanding its weight, made Soo-jin go still. "And her father?" Jide shrugged, already looking back toward Blessing, already halfway back into a world Soo-jin wasn't part of. "He works a lot." That was the first thread. Soo-jin pulled it without knowing what she was unraveling. She followed them 3 days later, not proudly, not with any illusions about what it made her, trailing 2 blocks behind her own son on foot, keeping to the far side of the street, because some cracked, honest part of her needed to see with her own eyes where he went when the tracker said home and he wasn't. She watched him climb through the window. She watched him walk fast and low along a hedge line like he'd rehearsed it, She watched him disappear through a propped-open door held shut by a broken fan, into a house that looked, from the street, like nothing at all. Small, a little tired, a bike missing a wheel leaned against the porch rail, a single light on in what she guessed was the kitchen. She stood on the sidewalk for 11 minutes, mirroring the exact window of time she now knew by heart. And when 11 minutes passed and he didn't come back out, panic did something to her chest that no meditation app had ever undone. She crossed the street. She knocked. The man who opened the door was the same one from the school gate. Tie gone now, sleeves pushed up, a spatula still in his hand from whatever he'd been making, and his face went through 3 expressions in about a second and a half. Confusion, then recognition of the kid's name shouted from behind him, then something that looked almost like guilt, though he hadn't done anything yet to be guilty of. "Can I help you?" he said. "My son is in your house." It came out harder than she meant it to, harder than any first sentence to a stranger should sound. "Jide?" He turned his head and called back into the house, easy, unbothered, in a way that made her want to scream. "Blessing? Is Jide in there with you?" "Yeah, Dad, we're doing homework. They do this most nights, actually," the man said, turning back to her. And there was an edge in his voice now, too, a defensiveness rising to meet hers. "I didn't realize it was a problem." He climbed out his window. "At night. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is? He's 8 years old, walking 2 blocks alone in the dark, and you're just, what, feeding him snacks and letting him watch TV while you cook dinner at midnight?" "I'm working 2 jobs, lady. I didn't exactly plan for this to happen either, but I'll tell you what I do know. My daughter's had a friend for the first time in 2 years who actually makes her laugh, and if that's a crime, then arrest me." "It's not about laughing, it's about safety. Do you lock your doors? Do you even know where your daughter is most of the day?" Something flashed across his face. Not anger exactly. Something closer to a wound reopening. "Don't," he said low. "Don't you dare stand on my porch and tell me I don't know my own daughter. I'm telling you that a house where the front door doesn't lock isn't safe for any child. And I'm telling you that a house where a kid has to climb out a window to get 1 hour of freedom isn't exactly the picture of safe either, is it?" The words landed like a slap, because he wasn't wrong, and some buried, honest part of her, the part standing in that hallway last night with a book she never read a page of, flinched hard enough that she had to look away first. Some parents keep their kids so close they forget the kids need room to breathe. Some parents are so busy surviving they don't notice the room has gotten too big. Tell me honestly, in the comments, which one scares you more? Because this story is about to make you pick a side, and I promise you, by the end, you're going to regret it either way. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Somewhere behind him, the kids' laughter drifted from the kitchen, oblivious. And it was that sound, bright and easy and completely unaware of the storm happening on the porch, that made both adults soften, just slightly, just enough to stop shouting. "I want him home," Soo-jin said finally, quieter. "Then take him home," Emeka said, and stepped back to let her in, though something about his face said he hadn't fully forgiven the accusation, even as he let it go for his daughter's sake. Jide's face fell the second he saw her standing in the kitchen doorway. Blessing looked between the 2 adults with the particular sharp attentiveness of a kid who's learned to read a room for danger before anyone else notices there's a storm coming. "We're doing homework," Jide said, too fast, like the words could undo the last 10 minutes. "We're going home," Soo-jin said. "Now." The walk back was silent. Soo-jin held his hand the entire 2 blocks, gripping it the way you hold on to something you're terrified of losing, and Jide let her, because some fights weren't worth having in the dark on a sidewalk, but his jaw stayed tight the whole way, and when they got inside, he went straight to his room and shut the door without a word. She stood outside it for a long time. She thought about knocking. She thought about the man's voice, a kid who has to climb out a window to get 1 hour of freedom, and hated how much it had landed, and hated more that some tired, honest corner of her mind kept replaying his face at the door. The half-turn, the tired half-smile, that itch at the back of her skull she still couldn't place. She didn't knock. She went to bed and lay awake doing the math again. If he can climb out a window once, he can do it twice. And if I don't stop this now, where does it end? And somewhere in the doing of that math, she missed the actual question entirely. Not how do I stop him? The real one. Why does he need to escape me at all? One Sunday, some weeks into the fragile truce that followed, she arrived 20 minutes early to collect Jide and found him in the alley behind Amika's house. No helmet in sight, wobbling wildly on a bicycle 2 sizes too big for him, borrowed from a cousin down the street, Emeka jogging alongside with one hand hovering an inch from the seat, not quite touching. Sujin's whole body went cold. He doesn't know how to ride that. He's about to, Emeka said, not stopping, not even turning his head. Aren't you, Jide? I'm gonna fall, Jide called back, delighted and terrified in equal measure, the exact tone of a kid who has finally found the edge of something and likes standing on it. Probably, Emeka agreed cheerfully. Everybody falls the first 6 times. It's the 7th one that sticks. Sujin took 2 steps forward, already reaching, already halfway to the old reflex. Catch him, stop this, wrap him back in something padded and safe, and then made herself stop. Made herself stand at the mouth of the alley with her arms crossed hard over her chest, nails digging half-moons into her own skin, and watch. He fell on the 4th try. Hard, scraped elbow, a thin, bright line of blood, and for one unbearable second Sujin's whole body screamed to run to him, and she didn't, because Emeka hadn't moved either, was just crouched down at Jide's level saying something low and steady she couldn't hear, and Jide was already getting back up, jaw tight the exact same way it went tight when he was determined not to cry in front of her. By the 7th try, he stayed up. Wobbled the length of the alley and back, whooping, and the sound of it, pure, unfiltered joy, no glance back at her first to check if it was allowed, hit Sujin somewhere underneath her ribs she didn't have a name for. You could have told me you were teaching him this, she said afterward, quieter than she meant to once Jide had run inside for water. Would you have said yes? She opened her mouth to argue and found, honestly, that she didn't know. I don't know. That's why I didn't ask. Emeka wiped his hands on his jeans, not unkindly. I'm not trying to go around you, but if I check with you on every single thing that has a little bit of risk in it, we're never going to get past safe. And safe isn't actually the same thing as good, even though it feels like it should be. She didn't have an answer for that. She watched the scraped line on her son's elbow get rinsed under the garden hose, watched him hiss and then laugh about it 2 seconds later, and something in her chest that had been clenched shut for 6 years, loosened by one single, reluctant degree. That night, after Jide was asleep, she sat at the kitchen table, doing nothing in particular, and found herself replaying the sound of him, whooping down that alley, unwatched by her, unafraid, and realized with a small, uncomfortable jolt that some part of her had wanted, for one single reckless second, to be the kind of mother who could have taught him that herself. Not because Emeka had done anything wrong, because she had never once let herself imagine standing at the mouth of an alley and simply watching her son fall down and get back up without her hands, already halfway to catching him. She didn't know yet what to do with that feeling. She only knew it had a shape now, where before it had only ever been static. The new trust didn't hold evenly. 2 weeks after the bicycle afternoon, Jide and Blessing decided, without asking anyone, that walking to the corner store together counted as the kind of freedom they'd already been allowed, and so walking to the park 4 streets over must count too, by the same logic that made perfect sense to 2 8-year-olds and absolutely none to either parent. They were gone 40 minutes before anyone noticed. Sujin, who had come by to drop off a dish, found the house empty. Emeka, still at work. No note, no answer on Blessing's tablet where the two of them usually left messages for each other, and the particular, specific terror of 6 years came roaring back all at once, worse for having been let out of its cage even briefly. She called Emeka in a panic that cracked his focus clean through a shift he couldn't leave. He called the neighbors. He called Blessing's tablet 11 times in a row. By the time the two kids came wandering back up the street, sticky with ice cream money they'd pooled between them, utterly unaware that anything had gone wrong, Sujin's hands were shaking so hard she could barely unlock her own phone. "Where were you?" she said, and her voice broke in the middle of the question. 6 years of fear collapsing the careful new calm she'd been building for weeks. "The park," Blessing said, confused by the intensity, the way kids are always confused when an ordinary afternoon turns out to have been, unbeknownst to them, a crisis. "We always go to the park." "Not without telling anyone, not ever without telling anyone." Sujin was crying now, openly, in a way she hadn't let either child see before, and Jide's face went from confusion to a kind of stricken guilt she hated putting there but couldn't stop. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't think—" "That's exactly the problem." She pulled him against her, too tight, the old grip returning like muscle memory. "You didn't think because I've spent so long making every decision for you that you don't know yet what it costs to make a bad one." Emeka arrived 15 minutes later, having left work early despite what it would cost him in his paycheck, and found Sujin sitting on his front step with Jide still wrapped in her arms and Blessing standing awkwardly nearby, unsure whether she was in trouble too. "I almost said no to all of this," Sujin told him once the kids had been sent inside, her voice raw. "I almost said no to the whole idea of loosening anything, because for 40 minutes today, I felt exactly the way I felt the day the phone rang 4 times. And I don't know if I can keep doing that to myself over and over, just to prove I'm not the mother I used to be." Emeka sat down on the step beside her, close, but not touching. "You don't have to loosen everything at once," he said. "Nobody's asking you to go from locked windows to a whole unsupervised weekend in one afternoon. We build a ladder, not a cliff." "What if I fall off the ladder?" "Then you fall a little," he said, echoing, without meaning to, his own words to Jide in the alley weeks before. "Everybody falls the first 6 times. It's the 7th one that sticks." She didn't laugh, not quite, but something in her chest loosened half a degree, enough to breathe through instead of around. They agreed, that evening, on a new rule. The park was fine, but only with a check-in, a single text, nothing tracked, nothing surveilled, just a habit of letting each other know. A small compromise, built out of real fear on one side and real freedom on the other, meeting somewhere survivable in the middle. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the first rung of the ladder, and both of them, for the first time, were climbing it on purpose instead of being dragged. The following week settled into something almost like peace, though peace built on a truce is never quite as sturdy as it looks. Sujin, against every instinct she owned, allowed 1 supervised visit a week. Saturday afternoons, 2 hours, herself present the entire time, sitting stiffly on Emeka's mismatched couch with a cup of tea she never finished, watching Jide and Blessing build increasingly elaborate blanket forts in the living room, while pretending not to watch Emeka in her peripheral vision. He was, she had to admit, a decent cook, even exhausted, even with 2 jobs eating every spare hour of his day. He was patient with Blessing in a way that surprised her. Never rushed, never short, even when she could see the fatigue sitting behind his eyes like a weight he'd stopped noticing he was carrying. And more than once, she caught herself studying his face when he wasn't looking, chasing that itch again, trying to place him, failing, filing it away as nothing, as coincidence, as her own tired mind manufacturing patterns out of grief. It was Emeka who broke first. One Saturday when his second job called him in for an emergency shift and left him stranded, apologizing profusely on the phone to Sujin because there was no one else, no backup, no village to catch the fall. "I can pick her up from school if you want," Sujin heard herself say, and then immediately regretted it, and then didn't regret it at all when she saw Blessing's face light up at the idea of an afternoon with Jide that didn't require anyone hovering. It became a rhythm after that, unplanned and unspoken. Sujin covering the gaps Emeka's schedule couldn't fill. Emeka returning the favor on the rare evenings Sujin's rigid world cracked under its own weight. A late meeting, a doctor's appointment that ran long. Two parents who'd started as adversaries on a porch, slowly becoming something like reluctant allies, bound together by two children who refused to be kept apart. And in the small, unremarkable moments of that arrangement, folding Blessing's laundry because the girl clearly hadn't been taught how, watching her do her own homework unprompted and unassisted because no one had ever had time to sit with her, Sujin began to see the shape of a girl, raising herself in the gaps her father's exhaustion left behind. And in the moments of watching Jide at Emeka's kitchen table, loud and unguarded and laughing, actually laughing the way he used to before the world narrowed down to trackers and schedules, Emeka began to see the shape of a boy who had never once been allowed to just be a kid. Neither of them said any of this out loud. Not yet. It was Blessing who cracked the next door open on an ordinary Tuesday evening, curled up on the floor of her room with Jide sorting through a shoebox of old photographs she wasn't supposed to have found. "That's my mom," she said, holding one up. A younger woman, laughing at something off camera, an arm slung around a much younger Emeka. Jide looked at it for a long moment. "Where is she?" "She left, a long time ago. Before I really remember." Blessing turned the photo over in her hands, careful, like it might break. "She wrote me a letter last month. My dad doesn't know I found it. She wants to see me." "Are you going to?" "I don't know." Blessing's voice went smaller than Jide had ever heard it. "If I see her, it's like saying my dad wasn't enough. He works so hard. He'd be so sad if he knew I even wanted to." Jide was quiet for a while, turning the photograph over in his own hands, thinking about his mother, about the shoe that had stayed by the door for 3 days after his father died, about the way she'd rearranged her entire life around the fear of losing one more person, and about how none of that fear had ever once been explained to him in words he could actually use. "I want to be free without my mom thinking it means I don't love her," he said finally, quiet, like he was working it out for the first time as he said it. "Maybe it's the same thing. Wanting your mom back doesn't mean your dad wasn't enough. It just means you get to have both. That's not betraying anybody. That's just having more people who love you." Blessing looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, the particular quiet of a kid hearing a thing she needed to hear from someone young enough to say it without any of the complicated adult guilt attached. "I'm going to write her back," she said. Down the hall, unseen, Emeka stood frozen outside his daughter's door, having come up to call them, both for dinner, having heard every word through the gap, and did not move for a long time after because his 8-year-old daughter had just said something about Grace that he, at 36, had never once managed to give himself. It was around this same time that Sujin ran into Hana Park at the grocery store, of all places, standing in the cereal aisle with a cart half full of things Sujin didn't recognize as belonging to the version of Hana she used to know. The two of them had been close once, before Obi, before the folding chairs, before 6 years of a life narrowed down to a single terrified orbit around one small boy. They'd taken a pottery class together on Tuesday nights, a lifetime ago. Sujin hadn't thought about clay under her fingernails in longer than she could remember. "I haven't seen you since the funeral," Hana said, and then winced. "Sorry, that's a terrible way to open a conversation in a cereal aisle." "It's fine, it's true." Sujin managed something like a smile. "How are you? I'm actually still doing the Tuesday class. Different studio now, but same terrible instructor yelling at everyone about centering the clay." Hana said it lightly, testing the water. "You should come sometime, just saying." The old reflex rose up immediately, automatic as breathing. Who would watch Jide? What if something happened? Tuesday evenings were homework and dinner, and the tracker check before bed. And Sujin opened her mouth to say some version of no, the same no she'd said to every invitation for 6 straight years, and then, unbidden, she thought of Emeka standing at the mouth of that alley, arms loose at his sides, watching his own daughter learn to fall down without flinching toward her. "Maybe," she heard herself say instead, and the word felt strange and heavy in her mouth. like a muscle she hadn't used in years. She didn't go that week. She almost didn't go the week after either, standing in her kitchen at 6:15 on a Tuesday with her keys in her hand and every excuse already rehearsed, until Emeka, when she called to ask, so hesitant it embarrassed her, whether he might possibly be able to have Jide over for a couple of hours, said only, "Of course. Go. You don't have to explain it to me," in a voice so free of judgment that she found herself crying a little in the car before she'd even pulled out of the driveway, for reasons she didn't fully understand until she was sitting at a pottery wheel 2 hours later with wet clay collapsing between her hands for the third time in a row. "You're gripping too hard," the instructor called from across the room, not unkindly. "Let it be a little wrong. It'll find its shape." Soojin sat with her hands still on the spinning wheel, clay slick and cool and utterly indifferent to her fear of ruining it, and felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with the pot at all. She hadn't done a single thing in 6 years that existed only for her, not 1 hour that wasn't in service of keeping Jide safe, watched, accounted for. She had built her entire life into a fortress with exactly one purpose, and somewhere in the building of it, she realized now, sitting there, with ruined clay running down her wrists, she had quietly, completely disappeared. She didn't finish a usable pot that night. She went back the next Tuesday anyway. And the one after that. She didn't tell Jide where she'd been, not at first, only that she'd had an evening out and Emeka had been kind enough to help. But something in her had shifted, quietly, permanently, in a way she couldn't yet put into words. The beginning of an answer to a question she hadn't let herself ask in 6 years. Not how do I keep him safe forever? A smaller, stranger, far more frightening question. Who am I underneath all this watching? We're at the halfway point now, and if this story hasn't gotten under your skin yet, it's about to, because everything you think you understand about these two families is about to get turned completely upside down. Like this video if you're still with me. Comment where you think this is headed, and stay close because the next part is where it all starts to break open. Soojin found out about the letter by accident, the way most secrets in that house eventually surfaced. Blessing, distracted and trusting, leaving it out on the kitchen table while she ran to grab her shoes. And Soojin, there early for pickup as always, catching sight of the looping, careful handwriting of a child working hard to get every letter right, addressed to someone named Mom. She didn't read it. She wasn't that far gone, but she sat with the knowledge of it the whole drive home, turning it over, and that night, unable to sleep, she found herself doing something she hadn't done in 6 years. Pulling a shoebox of her own down from the top of her closet, sitting on her bedroom floor at midnight, sorting through photographs of a life she'd sealed away the day the phone rang 4 times. There, near the bottom, folded and soft with age, was a program from a support group she'd attended in the terrible year after Obi died. Bridge House Family Center. The paper read, "A circle of chairs and strangers, and grief too big for any of them to hold alone." She hadn't thought about it in years. She'd gone twice a week for almost a year, sat in that circle, said things out loud she'd never said to another living soul, watched other broken people slowly, painfully begin to put themselves back together. She'd been good at it, she remembered now. Good at sitting with other people's pain, better at that than her own, always had been. She stared at the program for a long time, and that itch at the back of her skull, the one she'd been chasing for weeks without catching, finally, quietly, began to take shape. She didn't say anything to Emeka. Not yet. She wasn't sure yet what she'd even found, but she started watching him differently after that. Not with suspicion now, but with something closer to recognition, waiting for the shape of a memory to fully resolve itself. The occasion that finally forced everything into the light was, fittingly, a celebration, Bridge House Family Center's 20th anniversary festival. held in the same community park where the center itself had once run its weekend programs. A sprawling, joyful, chaotic afternoon of food stalls and music, and a long photo wall set up along one fence. Decades of the center's history pinned up for anyone to wander past and remember. Sojin almost didn't go. But Blessing had mentioned offhand that her father's old counselor still volunteered there sometimes, still ran a table most years, and something in Sujin, call it curiosity, call it the itch finally demanding an answer, made her show up anyway, Jide's hand in hers, telling herself it was just a nice afternoon out. It was Jide who found the photograph first, tugging her sleeve, pointing at a section of the wall labeled Family Bridge Circle, 10 years ago. A grainy group photo, a dozen tired, hopeful faces sitting in a circle of folding chairs. And there, unmistakably, a much younger Sujin, and 2 seats over, a much younger Emeka, his arm around a woman who could only be Ngozi, all 3 of them caught mid-laugh at something the camera hadn't recorded. Sujin's breath left her all at once. "That's you," Jide said, delighted, having no idea what he'd just uncovered. "Mom, that's you?" She didn't answer. She was still staring at the photograph, 6 years of careful forgetting collapsing all at once. And it was in that exact moment that Emeka arrived at her shoulder, following his own daughter's excited pointing, and went just as still as she had. "I remember you," he said, quiet, disbelieving. "I remember your face. I never knew your name back then. We all went by first names only. That was the rule. But I remember you. You were the one who used to stay after, help stack the chairs. You talked to Ngozi for an hour once, the night she almost didn't come back. She told me later you were the reason she came back the next week." Sujin's throat had gone tight. "I don't remember that specifically. I remember the room. I remember everyone in it being in so much pain." She looked at him properly now. 6 years, and a lifetime later. "I remember you too. You used to bring extra snacks for everyone, even though you clearly couldn't afford to." "Ngozi and I were trying so hard back then," Emeka said, and something in his voice had gone rough. "We almost made it. We were so close." "What happened?" He was quiet for a long moment, the noise of the festival swirling around them, oblivious. "I got scared," he said finally, low enough that only she could hear it. "She was doing the work, really doing it. And I kept waiting for it to fall apart again, kept bracing for the moment she'd leave for good. And eventually I think I just made it happen sooner. Stopped answering calls. Moved before I told her the new address. I told myself I was protecting Blessing. I think I was really just protecting myself from having to watch it fail twice." Sujin stared at him, and something cold and sharp moved through her chest because she understood suddenly, all at once, that this man she had let watch her son, let into the fragile new architecture of trust she'd spent weeks rebuilding, had once held something precious in his hands and let it break because he was too afraid to keep holding on. And she was, at that exact moment, standing in a park holding a letter in her coat pocket that Jide had begged her to give him the courage to write his own version of. A request to spend an entire unsupervised weekend at Emeka's house. No tracker, no check-ins, real distance, the biggest leap of trust she had ever been asked to make. "You let it die," she said slowly, "because you were scared, and now you're asking me to trust you with the one thing I'm more scared of losing than anything else in this world." Emeka didn't flinch away from it, didn't make excuses, and something about that, the plain, unguarded way he simply absorbed the accusation without fighting it, was almost worse than if he'd argued. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what I'm asking. Every plan you thought you had for how this ends just changed, didn't it? If your stomach just dropped a little, good. That means this story's doing its job. Stay with me, because the next few minutes decide everything, and I promise you, it is not going to go the way you think." They didn't finish the conversation at the festival. There wasn't time, and there wasn't privacy, not with 2 children weaving in and out of the crowd around them, not with Ngozi somewhere in that same park, having finally worked up the courage to come after weeks of careful letters, standing awkwardly near the entrance gate, scanning the crowd for a daughter she hadn't held in 2 years. Blessing saw her first, went very still, looked at her father, who had followed her gaze and gone equally still, an old grief and an old fear moving across his face in the same instant. "Dad," Blessing said, voice small. "Is that okay? Can I—" Emeka looked at his daughter for a long moment, and Sujin watched something happen in his face. The same reckoning she herself was in the middle of, compressed into 3 seconds. A father choosing, right there in a crowded park, whether his own fear got to win one more time. "Go," he said. "Go say hi to your mom." Blessing walked toward Ngozi slowly, the whole distance of the park stretching out like something that mattered, and when she finally reached her, Ngozi dropped to her knees right there in the grass and wrapped her arms around her daughter, and neither one of them said anything for a long time, just held on, both of them crying in the unself-conscious way people cry when 6 years of careful walls come down all at once. Sujin watched it happen, and beside her, Emeka watched too, jaw tight, hands in his pockets, visibly fighting every old instinct that told him to intervene, to protect, to keep the walls up. "That's the bravest thing I've ever seen you do," Sujin said quietly. "I almost didn't do it." "I know, that's what makes it brave." He turned to look at her then, and there was something raw in his face, something that had been sitting behind his eyes since the moment they'd found that photograph. "I'm not going to pretend I have this figured out," he said. "I sabotaged the last chance I had at something good because I was scared. I don't get to promise you I won't be scared again, but I can tell you I see it now, clearer than I've ever seen anything. And I want to be the kind of man who doesn't let fear make his choices for him anymore. For Blessing. And if you'll let me, for Jide too this weekend, and every weekend after, if that's what he needs." Sujin looked past him, at Jide, who was standing a little apart from the reunion happening in the grass, watching Blessing and her mother with an expression of quiet, complicated joy. Happy for his friend. And underneath that, she could see it now. Something else. Something that looked a great deal like longing for a freedom of his own that he'd never once been brave enough to ask for out loud. Not really. Not until a girl 2 years wiser than her age had given him the words for it. She thought about the shoe by the door. She thought about 6 years of locks and trackers, and a hallway floor she'd sat on all night with a book she never read. She thought about Blessing's blunt, fearless voice at the school gate. You should ask him why instead of just being scared about it. And she thought, finally, about the question she'd been avoiding since that very first night. Not, how do I keep him safe? The real one, the one that had been waiting patiently under all the others the whole time. What does he actually need from me? And am I brave enough to give it to him even when it terrifies me? "Come by the house tonight," she said to Emeka. "Not for the kids, for us. We need to actually talk this through. All of it. What happened with Ngozi? What you're asking me to trust you with. I'm not saying yes yet, but I'm not saying no either, and I think that scares me more than anything has in 6 years. We are so close to the end now, and I need you to comment below the second you finish this. Because what happens in that kitchen tonight is going to split this comment section right down the middle, and I want to know exactly where you land. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because there is one more turn left, and it's the one that's going to stay with you. Emeka came by that evening after the kids were fed and settled in front of a movie in the living room, voices low so they wouldn't be overheard. Sujin made tea and neither of them drank. They sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd doubled down on locks and rules for 6 long years, and talked for 2 hours straight. No interruptions, no softening. She told him things she'd never said out loud to anyone. About the phone ringing 4 times, about the shoe by the door, about the year she'd spent in that circle of folding chairs, learning to survive her own grief by pouring herself into everyone else's, and how somewhere in the years since, she'd built a fortress around her son so total that she'd forgotten to build anything for herself at all. No friends she hadn't already lost touch with, no hobby, no single hour of any single day that belonged only to her, nothing but Jide, watched, tracked, scheduled, safe, always safe, never free. Neither of them. I haven't done a single thing just for myself since he died, she said, and hearing it out loud for the first time made something crack open in her chest that she'd been holding shut for 6 years. Not once. I told myself it was because I was a good mother. I think it might actually be because I was too afraid to find out who I was if I ever stopped. I've started something small, a pottery class of all things, and it terrified me more than I want to admit, sitting there with nothing to manage and no one to watch. Emeka listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he told her the rest of his own story, the parts he hadn't said in the park, how the fear of losing Ngozi twice had felt so unbearable that ending it on his own terms had seemed, at the time, like the only way to survive it. How he'd told himself for 2 years that he was protecting Blessing, when really he'd been protecting the smallest, most frightened part of himself, and left his daughter to grow up faster than she should have had to as the price of it. We did the same thing, Sujin said slowly, seeing it clearly now for the first time. Different shapes. Same fear. You ran from love because you couldn't survive losing it again. I built a cage around love because I couldn't survive losing it again either. Neither one of us actually protected anyone. We just protected ourselves from having to feel it happen twice. So what do we do now? Sujin was quiet for a long time, turning her cold cup of tea in her hands, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than she felt. I'm going to say yes to the weekend, she said. Not because I trust you completely. I don't know if I'll ever fully trust anyone completely again. That might just be a permanent scar, and I'm starting to accept that. But because I finally understand that the alternative, keeping him so close he never gets to find out who he is without me standing over his shoulder, isn't safety. It's just a slower kind of losing him. And I would rather hand him something real and be terrified the whole time than keep something small and safe and call it love. She said it out loud to Jide that night, sitting on the edge of his bed, the way she should have done 100 conversations ago instead of locks and schedules and a tracker that lied to her the one night it mattered most. You can go this weekend, she said. The whole weekend. No phone check-ins, no tracker. Real time, on your own, with Blessing and her dad. Jide stared at her like he wasn't sure he'd heard her right. Really? Really? Her voice cracked on the word, and she let it. Didn't try to hide it from him the way she'd been hiding everything from him for 6 years. I'm going to be so scared the whole time you're gone. I need you to know that. I'm not doing this because I stopped being afraid. I'm doing it because I finally understood that you deserve more than my fear. You deserve your own life. I need you to know how much I love you, underneath all of it. Every lock, every rule, every terrible check-in. It was never about not trusting you. It was about me not knowing how to trust the world not to take you too. Jai didn't say anything for a moment. Then he wrapped his arms around her, tight, the kind of hug he hadn't given freely in longer than either of them could remember, and said, muffled against her shoulder, I know, Mom. I always knew. I just needed you to know it too. This is it, the moment this whole story has been building toward. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't going to end with a neat little bow. And that's exactly why you need to stay for the last few minutes. Like this video right now, if it's hit you the way I think it has. And let's finish this together. The weekend arrived faster than Sujin was ready for, the way the hardest days always do. She packed Jide's small bag herself, hands steadier than her heart, and stood on Emeka's porch handing over her son, along with the one thing she had never once handed to another person in 6 years. His phone, powered off, tucked into the bottom of his bag. No tracker, no lifeline, nothing but trust, raw and untested, stretched thin across the 2 days ahead. I'll have him back Sunday evening, Emeka said. I promise you, Sujin, nothing happens to him on my watch. I know, she said, and mostly believed it. That's not actually what I'm afraid of anymore. Friday night, after Emeka's car pulled away with Jide waving through the back window until he disappeared around the corner, Sujin stood on her own porch for a long time before she could make herself go back inside. The street was ordinary, kids on bikes 2 houses down, a sprinkler ticking somewhere, the whole neighborhood utterly unbothered by the fact that her entire architecture of safety had just driven off in a stranger's— No, not a stranger's, she corrected herself, an ally's, a friend's, whatever this new and terrifying category was, car. taking the most precious thing in her life somewhere she couldn't reach in under 30 seconds for the first time in 6 years. She almost called Hana, got as far as pulling up the number, thumb hovering, before she put the phone face down on the counter instead, because some part of her understood that this particular night wasn't one to be distracted through. It was one to be felt, all the way down, whatever that turned out to cost her. She drove home to an empty house and sat down at the kitchen table where 6 years of rules had been written and rewritten, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had absolutely nothing to manage. No schedule to enforce, no lock to check, no tracker to refresh every few minutes like a compulsion she'd never named as one. Just silence, and a house too big for one person, and a grief she'd buried so deep under logistics that she'd almost convinced herself it wasn't there anymore. It found her that first night, all at once, the way floods do, not gradually, but as a wall of water she had no way to brace against. She cried on her kitchen floor for the first time since the year of the folding chairs. Cried for Obi, for the shoe by the door, for 6 years of loving her son so hard she'd forgotten to let herself be loved back by the rest of the world, for a version of herself she barely recognized anymore, who used to laugh easily, who used to have a life that belonged only to her. She let herself feel every bit of it, because for once, there was no one to be strong for, no lock to check, nothing to do but sit inside the emptiness and let it finally be what it was. 2 blocks away, Jide was having the best weekend of his life, and did not know, could not know, exactly what it was costing his mother to give it to him. He and Blessing built a real fort this time, not a blanket one, out of scrap wood in the backyard. Emeka helping with the hammer and nails, laughing at their terrible carpentry, letting them make every decision themselves even when it went wrong. "That plank's crooked," Blessing said, squinting at their handiwork. "Everything's crooked," Jide said. "That's what makes it ours." Emeka, 3 nails deep into a board that was, in fact, going in sideways, didn't correct either of them. "Man's got a philosophy," he said, and let the crooked board stay crooked, because some things weren't his to fix. Not anymore. Not if the whole point of the weekend was letting these 2 people figure out their own version of right. Saturday afternoon, Jide walked to the corner store alone to buy candy with his own allowance, an ordinary errand that would have been unthinkable a month earlier, and the walk there and back took him past 4 intersections he crossed with careful, unsupervised judgment. Nobody had ever let him practice before, and nothing happened, nothing at all, except that he came back a little more sure of himself than he'd left. He came back 20 minutes later with a bag of candy split unevenly, more for Blessing than for himself, because she'd helped him count out exact change at the register when the cashier had gotten impatient, and some debts, even small ones, felt important to a boy who was still learning what fairness looked like when nobody was standing over him keeping score. "You didn't have to give her the bigger half," Emeka said when Jide mentioned it over dinner. "I wanted to," Jide said, like it was obvious, like it had never once occurred to him that generosity needed a reason beyond wanting to. Saturday night, after both children were finally asleep, worn out from crooked forts and corner store errands, Emeka sat alone on his own back step and did something that took him considerably more courage than building anything with a hammer ever had. He called Ngozi. "I wanted to say something," he told her when she picked up, surprised. "I'm not going to disappear again. Not on you, not on Blessing. If this, whatever this is, whatever it becomes, is going to work, I need you to know I see the old pattern now, and I'm choosing not to run it again." There was a long pause on the line. "That's the first time you've ever said something like that to me without me having to ask first," Ngozi said finally, her voice thick. "I know, I'm 6 years late saying it, but I'd rather be late than never." Neither of them solved everything in that one phone call. There was too much history for a single conversation to carry. But it was a beginning built on something sturdier than fear. And when Emeka hung up, he sat a while longer under the porch light, feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like a man choosing his life, instead of surviving it. Saturday evening, alone in a house that no longer felt like it was holding its breath. Soo-jin did something she hadn't done in longer than the 6 years she usually measured her grief in. She went back to the studio, uninvited by anyone, unscheduled, simply because she wanted to, and sat at a wheel by herself while Hana worked 2 tables over, and this time the clay didn't collapse. It wasn't good. It was lopsided and thick at the base and would never hold water properly. But it was hers, made by her own hands, for no reason except that she had wanted to make something that existed outside of keeping anyone safe. And when she carried it home wrapped in a plastic bag that night and set it, still wet, on the kitchen windowsill, she looked at it for a long time and thought that it was, in its own crooked way, the truest thing she had made in 6 years. Sunday evening, Emeka drove him home himself, walked him to the door, and Soo-jin opened it to find her son standing there, sunburned and grass-stained and grinning, in a way she hadn't seen since before the shoe stayed by the door for 3 days. He hugged her the way he always did, but something in the hug was different, and she felt it immediately. Looser, easier, a hug given because he wanted to give it, and not because he sensed she needed it. The small, unteachable difference between a child performing love out of guardedness and a child simply, freely, loving his mother because that's what he felt like doing in that moment. He didn't ask permission to go inside and drop his bag in his room. He didn't check her face first to gauge whether it was safe to be excited about his own weekend. He just was unguarded, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever watched happen to him, and it broke something in her chest at the exact same moment it healed something else. Both feelings arriving together, inseparable, the way the truest things in life so often are. "I missed you," he said, and it sounded like something that could be true, even while being wildly, thoroughly happy about a weekend spent entirely without her. "I missed you too," she said, and did not tell him. Not that night, maybe not ever in words he'd fully understand until he was much older, that some part of her had spent the whole weekend on her kitchen floor, learning how to survive missing him in a way that didn't require keeping him small enough to always be within reach. 3 blocks away, in a different kitchen, Ngozi sat across from Blessing at the table for the first time in 2 years, both of them still finding their footing, still careful with each other in the particular way of people rebuilding something that broke once and might break again. But trying anyway, because trying was better than the alternative, because Emeka had finally understood that love worth having was never going to come without risk attached, and had decided finally, at 36 years old, that he would rather risk it than keep protecting himself into a smaller and smaller life. Soo-jin stood in her son's doorway that night watching him sleep and did not check the tracker app, because she deleted it that morning, an act so small and so enormous that her hands had shaken doing it. She thought about the itch at the back of her skull that had led her, weeks ago, to a photograph on a fence in a park, and thought about how strange it was that the thing that finally set her free had been waiting, patiently, in a memory she'd nearly let herself forget completely. She had gotten exactly what was right, and she had lost, quietly, permanently, some small piece of the boy who used to need her for absolutely everything. Both were true. Both would stay true for the rest of her life, sitting side by side, the way the truest things always do, not a happy ending exactly, and not a sad one either. Just an honest one. A real one. The only kind she was beginning to understand that had ever actually been worth having. A few weeks later, the ladder Emeka had described became something like a permanent fixture in both households. Not a straight line, not without its wobbles, but real, load-bearing, tested. Jide got his own key to Emeka's house, an actual metal key on a shoelace he wore around his neck like a medal. Blessing started spending Wednesday afternoons with Ngozi, tentative at first, then less so, then simply ordinary, the way the extraordinary always eventually becomes ordinary if you let it. Soo-jin kept going to Tuesday pottery, kept bringing home lopsided, imperfect things that held water anyway, more or less, most of the time. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, that's exactly why this channel exists. Stories about the love that costs us something real. Subscribe if you want more of them. Drop a comment telling me whether Sujin made the right call, and I'll see you in the next one.